Warren Reno is pleased to participate in the New Hampshire Bar Review's Oral History Project, and I am Margaret Landsman, and I'm interviewing Mr. Orr, Dudley Orr, who is a founder of Warren Reno, and talking about his recollections of the early practice of law and his life. Mr. Orr, perhaps it's too forward to ask this, but how old are you?
I'll be 83 in June.
Does that feel old?
Yeah, well, in a sense it does, and in other ways it doesn't. I'm happy to be able to say that I realize I am old, but I don't feel decrepit.
What would it feel like to be decrepit?
Well, I suppose you'd feel that you couldn't get up in the morning.
Well, you were born, as I understand it, in 1907.
That's correct.
And you were born in Concord.
That's true.
Which is rather unusual, I think.
It is. I've always lived in Concord, except for the times that I was away at school and during my short service in the Navy.
Why do you think it is unusual?
Well, because most people I know don't live all their lives in one place. It used to be common, of course, and up until a couple of hundred years ago, almost everybody lived all his or her life in the same place.
Your parents, were they from Concord?
Oh, my father was an immigrant from Canada, and my mother was born in Concord, as a matter of fact, although her ancestors came from Barnstead.
From Barnstead.
Yeah, a long way out.
Well, the fact that your father was from Canada, did that have any impact on you at all? Did it have any impact on the way he viewed himself and his family here?
Oh, of course it did, because to some extent he was part of a different tradition, although his mother's family were descendants of United Empire Loyalists who left the United States at the time of the Revolution and moved up to Canada. His father's family were immigrants into Canada from Northern Ireland and brought with them some of the prejudices that still rage over in that unfortunate country.
Prejudices such as?
Religious prejudices.
So you heard that as you grew up?
Well, not from my mother or her family, but to some extent from my father's family, although I was much closer to my mother's family than my father's family, because most of them moved out to Western Canada.
Well, you know, today Concord is bursting at the seams. There's talk of putting in a huge road to go around the city, to bypass the city. That I think there's been talk for some time. I wonder if there was any thought that Concord would ever be like that when you were a young boy.
From time to time, there were extravagant dreams about Concord. In 1846, when the Northern Railroad was built connecting Concord with White River Junction, there was a great boom inland out on what were called the Dark Plains, and that's the area in which the new shopping center is about to be built. And that's almost 140 years ago, and that area out there was all carved up into lots, and some of the lots were sold, and they were rested for 125 years before much happened. And similar experiences transpired throughout the state during that period, where people had extravagant ideas about how the railroad track through Concord up to Montreal would open up the Great West, and there would be another avenue to get west in addition to the Erie Canal. And from Boston west, there was always the obstacle of the Berkshires to get over until they built the Moffat Tunnel. But by after the Civil War, hopes for development of Concord began to die down, and by the 80s, and the great development of the mills around New Hampshire had reached its peak. Although there were some mills built in Manchester after that, the great development in Manchester and most of the textile towns around New Hampshire had reached its peak before the end of the 19th century. so that Concord was a pretty somnolent place when I grew up.
Do you see any evidence of that today? Do you see things today that remind you of those times?
Well, of course, there are lots of reminders around in the physical geography of Concord and other towns, Manchester and all the rest of them, where you can identify houses that were built 100 or more years ago, or by the existence of barns and the layout of the structures. But I think that right now the state is recovering from the shock of having been for the past 10 years at least the fastest growing state east of the Mississippi, with the exception of Florida. And that has caused a good deal of the anguish that some people are now suffering with respect to the halt in the vault in real estate values that occurred during the past 8 or 10 years.
What did your father do? Why did he come here?
Well, my father came here because the life on a subsistence farm just south of Quebec City was pretty limited. And he came down here to have a better chance to improve his lot in life. And he did.
He did? What did he do?
Well, he was a contractor. He was in the plumbing and heating business. And at that time, at the turn of the century, when he got started, it was a pretty good business because most of the houses were heated with stoves. There was relatively little central heating, and there was limited indoor plumbing. And so it was a growth industry up until the 1940s, when people were pretty well accustomed to having those amenities of central heat and plenty of indoor facilities, a more affluent style of domestic life.
What, obviously, what he did is in some ways not at all connected to what you ended up doing in law. But what nuggets did you mine from him, do you think, that somehow contributed to what you became?
Well, it's hard to define the reasons of the affection and respect that you have for people that have been close to you. But I always think of my father as essentially a generous, optimistic, gregarious, friendly man. He never undertook to instruct me in what my essential moral posture ought to be, except one time he told me, he said, give the other fellow a hand. And I've always remembered that.
You did? Why?
Well, because I thought that was very good advice. Try to help other people. That's what we're on earth for, I think. And that's my greatest satisfaction in the practice of law, when I felt that somebody came to me and I was able to help them and have them leave feeling a little better than they did when they came in.
When did you know, or were you seized with something at a young age that said, I'm going to practice law? How did it evolve that you got into law?
No, I never had any great vision that this is my calling. I didn't have a light from on high, say, go to India and convert the heathen. My father had friends who were lawyers, and it seemed to him to be a more agreeable style of life than installing bathtubs and furnaces. And my mother, who was a college graduate, felt that it was a more intellectually rewarding activity than working with your hands or working with tools. And also, it was more congenial to me.
Were lawyers, when you grew up, revered and respected, or were they, in some ways, the way they are today, in some quarters anyway.
Dime a dozen.
A dime a dozen and objects of scorn.
Well, no, back in those days, every little town that happened to have a lawyer was generally addressed as Squire so-and-so. And while he might not be as much respected as the minister among the general population, or as deferred to as the local mill owner, he yet was considered to be somebody of significance. It was not a step down in the world for the son of a man who started to make his living working with his hands.
When you went to college, you went to Dartmouth.
Yes.
Why did you go there?
Well, I went to Concord High School, and then I spent 2 years at Phillips Exeter Academy. And at that time, my father was very friendly with then Governor John Wynant, who was a Princeton graduate and had been vice rector of St. Paul's School. And so my father thought that John Wynant would be a good advisor as to the choice of colleges. And Wynant advised me to go to Dartmouth because he said it was, if I was going to plan to live in New Hampshire, as I then did, the associations would be much more broad and useful than if I'd gone to Princeton.
Do you think he was right?
Well, so far as I'm concerned, it all turned out happily. Although I think Princeton's a great institution, just as I think Dartmouth is.
Was it odd to be from New Hampshire and go to Dartmouth?
Oh, no, that was a conventional thing to do. The greatest number of young men going to college when I graduated from Exeter in 1925 went to Dartmouth if they could afford it. Then it was more convenient and less expensive than going farther away. And the proportion of New Hampshire boys at Dartmouth in those days was high.
What was it like then at the school?
With the college?
Yeah. How would you describe it?
Well, it was in a period of transition, as it almost always is. I think institutions like our privately supported institutions of colleges are always in some kind of a ferment. And at Dartmouth at that time, in 1925, they had just gotten over giving up compulsory chapel because Dartmouth, up until the advent of President Tucker in 1893 or thereabouts, was one of the most conservative colleges in the country theologically. The then president, President Bartlett, was outraged at Darwin's theory of evolution and would have nothing to do with teaching it or explaining it to the students. And so when I got to college, they were just recovering from that big shock of taking a considerable turn away from being a theologically driven institution, although this change had been gradual. And also the period 1925 to 1929 when I was there was one of great business expansion in the country. You've probably read John Dos Passos' books about the big money and the Manhattan Transfer and so on that describe the big boom. And to some extent it is comparable to what has happened in our lives during the 80s. Everyone expected they were going to make a lot of money as soon as they got out into business and make it quickly, and they
Were you driven that way? Did you have
No, I
those same
wasn't
thoughts?
particularly driven that way, although everyone thought, including my parents, and the general sentiment was that progress was inevitable. Nevertheless, at that time, there were some people who were pointing out that that wasn't true, that we weren't going to forever continue to get richer and richer, and that there was, well, people that even at that time were exploring the whole basic idea of evolution, supporting the idea that human beings were put on Earth by some divine force that had constructed the whole universe for the benefit of human beings.
What did you study when you were there?
Well, I studied, well, we had certain required courses, and so...
What was your major?
My major was history.
It was history.
Yeah, yeah.
Does that make sense to you today, that your major was history?
Oh, yes. It gave me a framework to hang things on, so that when I think of the Industrial Revolution or the Reformation or the fall of Rome, I have an idea of what was happening in different places and so on.
How significant was your experience there? How much of an impact did it have on you, being at Dartmouth?
Well, it had a tremendous impact on me as an individual, because it gave me a sense of achievement and self-confidence.
How was it different than Phillips Exeter, where you had spent a few years before that?
A couple of years. Well, intellectually it was much less demanding. And
Did that bother you? Did that bother you?
No, that was
being...
very agreeable, because it was easier to excel. But
I know
well,
that
other than that, it wasn't very different. Of course, it was an all-male institution then.
Have you remained close to people there?
Well, I have. I was very close to the college and its administration, because I was a trustee for 30 years, from 1941 to 1980, about 71. But during the past 19 years it is now, of course, I've been disassociated from any formal connection. I'm not as close, and then also all my contemporaries are, a lot of them aren't around anymore.
Speaking of contemporaries, going back a little farther before we move on, because you stayed in Concord, did you maintain relationships with people you grew up with here? Were they as important, or was it different than, say, the relationships you formed in college?
Well, I maintained my relationships with people that I grew up with. An interesting thing about my childhood was that there were very few children in Concord. It was a stagnant community population-wise, and in the area where I grew up, there are offhand, there's only one person that I remember who was an exact contemporary who's still alive and living in Concord. But all my life I maintained relationships with boys that I went to elementary school with, and a few of the girls. Of course, the girls tended to move away, and lost track of them.
When you think about that today, does that seem unusual?
I don't think it's unusual. It would be unusual well, if you move around a lot, it makes it much more difficult to keep track of these people. But
well, Concord, before again we move on, in the let's say those first 21 years, Concord changed a lot, didn't it?
It didn't change a great deal during those first 21 years.
It
changed a good deal, but it didn't change as it has changed in the past 20 years.
Well, for example, in terms of transportation, how did you, when you were young, how did you get around, and how had that changed in those 20 years? It had changed a lot, hadn't it?
Well, from 1907 to 1925, we still get around on streetcars. The number of automobiles was very limited. You could park a car anywhere you wanted. The streets were mostly still unpaved. The schools were exactly where they were in 1925. They were just where they were in 1907, but that's no longer so. And most of the schools have been torn down, and they were torn down, well, within the more recent 30 years. And the geography of the town has changed, and we no longer have street cars. And
How about horses?
well, of course, horses went out pretty much by 1915, but I remember as a child, from 1907 to 1913, until my family moved to Vancouver for a short sojourn, my father kept a horse. And I frequently think now of how much we take for granted the ability to go out and jump into a car and it starts up and off we go. But if my father wanted to take my mother and me for a drive on a winter afternoon, he had to get the horse out of the stall and take the blanket off him and back the horse into the sleigh and hitch up the harness and get out the robes, and big operation.
So
Say nothing of feeding and taking care of the horse every night and morning.
Did you do that?
I did for a while. I had a little horse during the early 20s.
When you finished at Dartmouth, at that point, did you know where you were headed?
Yes, I knew I was going to go to law school.
You did know?
Yeah.
Why? How did you know? When did you make that decision?
Well, I made that decision during my senior year, although I'd generally inclined in that direction. Although of my contemporaries in the senior class at Dartmouth, more of them went to law school than did anything else.
And how many people would that be? Would that be a lot?
Oh, it would be 50 or 60 out of a graduating class of 400 and something. I took a year off after I got out of college and went to Europe. I was lucky enough to get a grant that enabled me to do that, and then I came back in the 30s just as the Depression got underway.
You went to France, am I right?
Yes, I did.
And what did you study there?
Well, I lived with a French family and on the eastern end of Paris, which was the unfashionable end, and I just kind of roamed around and had a wonderful time.
Was that
Traveled around Europe.
Was that an important experience for you?
Oh, sure.
Why?
Important, sure. It'd be important an experience for anyone.
But what
Well,
did it open up for you?
Well, it opened up for me not a knowledge, but an experience of the kind of lives that people lived in the countries from which most of the inhabitants of the United States have come. And so far as concentrating on France, it was just a wonderful place to be in late 1929 and early 1930. A lot was going on, political crises, there were quarrels among the French and the Germans and the English about the settlement of war debts and matters of that sort, and well, it was just great to be there.
That was the first or second?
And also to get another language.
Did you become fluent in French?
Well, I became reasonably fluent, but I was by no means bilingual.
Well, being in Europe at that time, that was what, the first or second year of the Depression, am I right? Or the beginning?
Beginning. The
Yes.
big crash came in October 1929, and it really didn't strike hard until, beginning of 1931. 1930 was a very down year, but most people didn't realize how bad it was going to be.
Was that true when you were in France?
No. Oh, no. Of course, I wasn't as interested in economic and business affairs then as I am now. Incidentally, so far as speaking French is concerned, I think I've told you this, that when I came back, Governor Wynot was running for a second term as governor, and I went down to Suncook, which at that time was much more of a French-speaking community than it is now, and I undertook to make a speech in French. And of course I made it in a Parisian accent, and everyone laughed.
It sounded a little hoity-toity.
Yeah.
You came back and you went to Harvard.
That's right.
You mentioned that half of your, well, not half, but a large percentage of your class actually went into law as well. It reminds me of today. A lot of people go to law school when they finish.
They think it's a good preparation for life.
Did you feel that way then? Is that what you were thinking?
No, I knew I wanted to make my living as a lawyer. Although I probably didn't concentrate as much on it as I would if I were going to do it again. The procedure at the Harvard Law School in those days was very elementary and simple. They took in a big class and flunked out half the first year people, which was very wasteful of the time of the students as well as of the faculty and the institution. But they got over that.
When you say they flunked out half, are you saying it was they deliberately got rid of half the people?
Yeah, that's true.
Why?
Well, because operating a law school is a fairly low-cost activity compared to a medical school. You don't have to have much equipment except a paper and a pencil and a library. And Harvard had the wonderful library. And so they could take a great big class, and most of the instruction was by lecture. And you were turned loose to find your way as best you could. And there were no exams until the end of the year. And you either passed them or you flunked them. If you flunked them, you were out.
Wasn't that structure a little bit unsettling for you?
Well, yes, it was a little unsettling for everybody, but people were used to it. And since a lot of them had gone there not knowing what they wanted to do and why they went in the first place, it wasn't too devastating.
What you just said, is that really any different than people in law school today? People go to law school today because they don't know what they want to do.
Well, that's true, and people go to business school for the same reason, or people take jobs with the Peace Corps and do other things because they don't know what to do, and that's not unusual, and I think that's been always true, except that we're able to do that in this country because we have so many resources that we can afford to let people loaf. And in less rich societies, you have to get out and work in order to eat.
Well, even though you had this one exam at the end of the year, so this was hanging over your head the entire year, was it easy for you? Was it nerve-wracking?
No.
It was pretty easy.
Well, I try to avoid nerve-wracking situations.
Do you think that you could have gotten a better legal education? Did you get a good one?
Oh, I think I did. I could have gotten a better one if I'd worked harder at it. Sure.
But do you think that it could have been structured differently?
Oh, it's structured differently now.
It
Oh,
is.
yes.
And do you think it's better than it was then?
Oh, yes. I'm sure it is. And it's much more efficient. They don't let people in unless they're pretty sure they're going to make it.
Mm. What did you do in between years at Harvard? Did you work for lawyers?
Well, the first summer, the summer of 1931, I guess that was a Wynot campaign, and I rode around with him. And then the next summer I worked in a law office in Syracuse, and the summer after that I worked in the McLean firm down in Manchester.
And that's where you eventually went, am I right?
Yes, that's where I
You
started.
did. When you emerged from Harvard, did you feel confident and prepared? Were you ready to take the reins of the law and ride?
No, I didn't know anything about what to do. It, it was sort of on-the-job training.
How did you learn?
Well, of course, at the law school you were trained on how to write a brief and how to argue an appeal, and that was one of the first things that they gave me to do. And then they'd also give me a job of running around to collect evidence or collect bills or foreclose mortgages and things of that sort. And
Was that, you mentioned collecting bills.
Mhm.
Was that good training?
well, it was good training and learning how exiguous the circumstances of lots of people get.
What do you mean?
Well, when people can't pay their bills, they're in a tough fix.
So,
And so if you go around and ask them why they haven't paid, then you'll find out all about it. So that tends to develop your sympathy for poor people.
did it make it harder, though, to collect money on bills that were owed?
Well, I was never a professional bill collector, and I never would have been a good one because I don't want to press people who have hard luck, and they sometimes have hard luck as a consequence of their own folly, but still, you can't help sympathize with them.
Being a first-year associate at McLean, what was that like? Was it did it make you, was it nerve-wracking, to use that word again?
No, no, no.
Was there a lot of pressure to perform
no.
and bill hours?
No billable hours. You're supposed to rack up time. Also, I became aware that you didn't get paid for doing nothing, and one of the things that you could do was attract business. And so I was lucky to be able to do some of that,
So
round up cases.
how important is that in your mind?
Well, that's the name of the game. If you don't have clients, you're spinning your wheels.
How big was McLean then?
Oh, there were John McLean, Ralph Davis, John Carlton, Peter Woodbury had just left to go on the bench, and Harriet Mansfield, who subsequently became a member of the bar, sort of ran the business end, and Kenny Graff and myself. That was it.
Was that considered a large firm at the time?
Yes, I'd say so, although the main other firm in Manchester at that time was the Wyman firm. Wyman, Starr, Booth, and Wadley it eventually became, or it was then, I think. And there were 5 or 6 people there, and my contemporary Ralph Langdell. And up here there was the DeMond, Woodworth, Selloway, Piper. That's now the Selloway office, and I think there were maybe 7 or 8 lawyers there, and Robert Upton had a partner and maybe 1 or 2 younger people, and Murchie and Murchie, 2 brothers with 1 associate. And that was pretty much it so far as the active trial practice was concerned in those 2 cities. In Manchester there was Devine and the Devine firm, and there were 1 or 2 others that I don't remember.
But there really weren't that many lawyers, were there?
Oh my, no. Here in Concord at that time, when I moved up here and went into the Attorney General's office, I knew all the lawyers. and knew all the ones who were in private practice.
Well,
or active practice.
What did that mean in terms of the way that law was practiced?
It was much more informal. It was much more expeditious, and it was, of course, a good deal more efficient so far as the clients are concerned. You could get a lot more done at expenditure of a lot less time.
How about in terms of the courts then? What were they like?
Well, the courts were not crowded. If you got a prompt trial of a civil case, I think I told you once that during the 30s, if you look through the cases in the Supreme Court, the principal litigant was the Boston and Maine Railroad. And the state of New Hampshire hardly figured. There were maybe one or two criminal appeals. Last year, the railroad had disappeared, of course, and the state had, 50, 60, 100 cases, indicating the extent to which criminal appeals have crowded the courts.
What does that say to you? That
Well, it
things
says
have changed
to
so
me
much.
that the administration of law in our country is probably very inefficient. And I wish I knew more about how it's done in other advanced countries.
Could you have imagined in the 30s the courts?
I could have never imagined that our courts would be as crowded as they are now.
Really?
Oh, it's just appalling.
Do you have any ideas why it has happened that way?
Well, it's basically it's happened because we have an adversary system of getting at the truth, and it's bound to be a time-consuming and expensive process, despite all the advances that have been made in procedure and discovery, and not treating it as a game the way it was to some extent 50 years ago. And it's the other reason why the administration of justice is so expensive and so slow is that the administration of the laws has become so much more complex. As we've already indicated, the number of lawyers practicing in New Hampshire has probably increased by 1,000%. That is 10 times as many. And that correlates with the number of pages in the general statutes. It's multiplied at least 10 times.
Can you think of a case? Oh, pardon me. Go ahead.
Well, and if the function of lawyers is to administer the laws and see to it that they're applied and carried out and executed honestly and fairly, particularly fairly, with due concern for the interests of the poor people as well as the rich people, it's a very complicated situation, and it gets more complicated every day. We've been through, since the war, what I call 4 great revolutions. The first, and perhaps the most important, is the social revolution, the change in the status of women. The second, perhaps the second important, is the chemical revolution. For example, when I first started to practice, we just barely got the sulfa drugs, and penicillin was barely coming into use. Now, just to cite one example, the chemical revolution, we have all kinds of drugs, and incidentally, we have all kinds of bad things coming out of them, like kids going around sniffing glue and all kinds of exotic things that didn't exist 50 years ago. But also, the chemical revolution has produced an abundance of food, such as we never dreamed we were going to have. Then we've had the nuclear revolution, which has changed the whole international outlook and the whole character of our federal government by having it overwhelmed by the military. And then we have had what I'd call the electronic revolution that we're enjoying right here. So, all these revolutions have just overwhelmed social relationships. Consider the matter of divorce. 50 years ago, a divorce was a rare thing, and it was a contested thing, and it was a big deal. Now, it's almost as routine as going to the post office and buying stamps.
Looking at
So far as the procedure is concerned.
looking
Yes.
at
The
for
human consequences is something else.
For example, you mentioned electronics,
Yeah.
which, as you say, we're enjoying today. Today, you have fax. As a lawyer,
The means of communication, you mean?
yes,
Yeah.
it's almost instantaneous.
FAX, not FACTS.
That's right. That's right. FAX. You can send something instantly to a client
Yes, that's right. Or to an adversary, or yeah.
anywhere,
Yeah. If the telephones work.
if the telephones work, assuming they work. How was that different in the 30s?
Well, first place, if you were going to communicate with another lawyer in general, if it was a matter of any importance, you were always cautious to send him a letter so that you could remember what you said and he couldn't deny that you had said it. So that took 48 hours at least, at the very least. Then if you wanted to see another lawyer and he happened to be in another town, you generally got there on a train. And although the train service was pretty good up and down the Connecticut Valley, 7 or 8 trains a day to and from Boston, if you wanted to go to Claremont or Portsmouth, it was a good deal more leisurely, and it occupied a whole day, which made everything a good deal more gentle and a good deal more leisurely.
Well, you mentioned
And
that.
you don't have anything like fax intruding on you.
Well, say for example, with something like fax, how do you think that changes the relationship between lawyers, for example, and then between a lawyer and a client? Does it?
Change the relationship. Well, I suppose it really doesn't change the relationship very much. You're still dealing with questions of what the actual events were that led up to the controversy or the problem that you're seeking to resolve. And so far as the time consumed is concerned, because of the congestion in many administrative agencies, Internal Revenue Service, for example, you can't expect to get an answer to an ordinary letter in much more rapidly than 6 weeks.
Would that be different?
That's sure different from what it was 50 years ago.
It is.
Sure.
Because it would have been a lot faster.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a certain irony there, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, you know, you mentioned that law has become much more complicated. And you have volumes and volumes of new laws that even those who drafted it don't always understand, or don't understand the consequences
That's
of what
right.
they've drafted. When you were in the early part of your practice, can you think of a case that perhaps you were involved in that today would have been much more cumbersome? Maybe even a case that was complicated then, but today would be even more so.
You know, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. Early on in my practice, I got out an issue of securities, a small amount of securities, to help finance a mine over in the southwestern corner of the state. And I'm quite sure I violated a good many of the rules and regulations of the securities legislation, but I didn't really know much about it, and everything went off well, and the bonds got issued, and the bonds got paid off, and so I had no problem. But today, I'm sure that I wouldn't dare do that. I would go to get an expert that did nothing else but handle securities work and make sure that we did everything according to Hoyle. But that's perhaps an extreme example.
You were, you have already mentioned that you were in the, excuse me, that you were in the Attorney General's office.
Yes.
In fact, there weren't very many people in the Attorney General's office, were there?
No, there were two of us, two lawyers, the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General, and I had the honor and responsibility of administering the legacy and succession tax, which had been enacted about 1902 or thereabouts. And the office had been created for that purpose. But it soon became a sort of assistant to the Attorney General. And depending on who the Attorney General was, the Assistant Attorney General more or less ran his own show. And
how old were you at that point?
well, let's see, 1935, I must have been 37, 38, no. I was born in 1907. Yeah, 28.
You were
I
young.
think. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Young and active.
Well, who was the Attorney General at the time that you were there?
Well, the first one was Francis Johnston, who later became a Superior Court judge and a Supreme Court judge, and the other was a man named Thomas P. Cheney, who was a lawyer from Laconia and who had ambition to be governor, and that was his principal preoccupation while he was Attorney General.
Were they, both of them, personalities? Do you remember aspects of them that...
They were different, completely different. Mr. Cheney was much more outgoing and more of a social type. Mr. Johnston was a Christian gentleman in every sense of the word, and a very thrifty one, and very kind and very conscientious. But he disliked controversy and people whose personalities grated on him.
Well,
so he turned a lot of stuff over to me.
and you were, you dealt with people a little bit easier. How important was the Attorney General then? How significant?
Well, he was the chief law officer, and he was supposed to try murder cases, that is, serious cases, and he was available at the call of the county solicitors. There was always a little bit of tension between the county solicitors and the Attorney General when it came to an important case, because the county solicitors were elected by popular vote, whereas the Attorney General was appointed by the governor. But I think, I haven't examined this too closely because never any row developed, but I dare say the Attorney General could intervene in any case he wanted to if he wished.
Did he have the same influence, or was it a matter of personality, whoever was in the Attorney General's seat?
Oh, yes.
As perhaps the Attorney General does today?
Well, the Attorney General then probably had less influence because he had less of an apparatus to work with. I mean, he just had himself, and it depended on how congenial he was with the governor and what the problems were they were trying to solve. I think that Ralph Davis was Attorney General before Francis Johnston, and a fellow named Irving Hinckley, who was a Democrat prior to that. And during that period when I was there in that office, we were trying to accommodate to the changes in legislation that were accepting greater social responsibility on the part of the state and local governments for taking care of poor people. And in that area, the Attorney General worked with the governor on legislation. I remember that, and the governor also generally had a legislative council, and Ralph Langdell at that time was counsel for Governor Blood that was later on. But anyway, when the Social Security legislation was adopted, unemployment compensation, it was more or less forced on the states, but we had to adopt laws to implement it, and the Attorney General and the Legislative Council for the governor worked on it and got it through the legislature, but it wasn't very tough to get through the legislature because you take it or else, as far you know. If you didn't do it, your people weren't going to get unemployment insurance.
You
The
mentioned
more difficult problems were the tobacco tax legislation and the liquor stores.
why were they so difficult?
Well, because that was, the legislature could do it or not. The federal government wasn't exerting much pressure. The tobacco tax was enacted, the first broad-based tax that we really had, broad-based sales tax, for the purpose of lifting part of the burden from the local real estate taxes. The cities and towns then were carrying the whole load, and they were contributing about a quarter, 25% of the total cost of running a state government. And the tobacco tax lifted that from the local tax burden and shifted it to the state.
So the tax issue is really nothing new.
Oh no, you bet. Well, the total state expenditures in 1939 were only $5 million. Today they're over 200 times as much. But the state, the local taxes, the cities and towns, total amount they collect has probably only grown about 30 times or 35 times, so that the big expansion in government has been from the top down.
You mentioned that you had to go to the legislature. You had to do some lobbying, is that right?
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, that was so far as when you were lobbying for the governor, you were generally rolling logs downhill because it was pretty well settled what was going to happen, and all you had to do was explain it.
Could you imagine that today?
Well, it depends, of course, on what the program is or was. From time to time, I think that, well, I would only be speculating. I offhand don't think of valid comparisons.
Let me make sure I have the chronology here. You left McLean to go to the AG's office.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you leave private practice, something that you obviously eventually returned to?
Well, because everyone, John Carlton and John McLean, they all agreed that the Attorney General's, Assistant Attorney General's office was a great place to get experience, and it was. It was the best job I ever had.
It was. Why?
Well, I mean, I was more or less my own boss, and I had all these interesting cases to deal with, appellate cases. I got to argue a case in the United States Supreme Court.
What was that case?
Well, it was a case involving the hours that truckers could work, and it was a question of whether the state law had been superseded by federal regulations.
Do you remember when you went and did that?
Oh, sure.
What was that like?
Oh, that was great. That was a big thrill. Charles Evans Hughes was the Chief Justice, and if you've ever seen pictures of him, he would look like a judge. He'd look like Moses. He had a big beard. And the court was very gentle with me. They didn't bother me. And I had an associate counsel who appeared for the National Association of Public Utilities Commissioners by way of defending the state power. And he was an old hand at this kind of thing in the court, and the court was a little abrupt with him, but I think we won the case, I think so. But it was subsequently superseded by federal legislation, so it was a Pyrrhic victory.
Was that I am not a lawyer, and I imagine that going to the Supreme Court could be, for some, the pinnacle. Was it for you?
Well, I thought it was a pretty high pinnacle. Matter of fact, I had to get a cutaway coat and striped pants. And sure, it was hot stuff.
When did you leave the Attorney General's office, and where did you go?
1937, I got appointed to the Tax Commission, which was a part-time job, which gave me a little revenue while I opened my own office and got my own practice started.
Where did you open your office?
Right across the street here at 4 School Street in association with a Dartmouth graduate who had graduated from college about 30 years before I had, named Benjamin W. Couch, who was a genuine character and a wonderful friend. And
Why was he such a character?
well, he had cultivated being a character. He'd been in the legislature a long time, and he'd been the majority leader, and along with another Concord man named Billy Ahern, who was the majority leader. And operating the House in those days was much more leisurely activity than it is now. And well, Mr. Couch was a wonderful storyteller and a very persuasive advocate. He didn't try cases much and didn't do much appellate work, but he was a very good business lawyer, and he would have been accused by some of his adversaries of being a friend of the rich.
What was your office like? Was it anything like Orr and Reno today?
Well, it was a good deal more opulent than Orr and Reno.
It was?
Oh, yeah, we had much bigger offices. Mr. Couch had a great big corner office and 2 great big safes where he kept the books, in which he kept his records. He had a big trust business that he ran more or less by hand, and he designed his bookkeeping system, and he loved to do it. And we had a great big entrance hall, which was presided over by Mr. Couch's secretary, Miss Halloran. And that room was at least 35 feet long and 20 feet wide and about 18 feet high, and 1 person in it. Very impressive.
You mentioned that he was known as a good friend of the rich. Was that something that bothered you at all?
No, that didn't bother me. I have nothing. I have no animosity towards the rich, so long as they're generous with their money.
Well,
no, he got that reputation because as the majority leader in the Republican House of Representatives, when the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company or the mill interests or the railroad interests had legislation, the Republican leadership was generally supportive of it. And one of the great railroad moguls back when Mr. Couch was developing his practice was Benjamin Kimball, who built that house down at the south end of town next to the Capitol Theater. And Mr. Kimball was a director of the Boston Main Railroad and also the owner of the Ford and Kimball foundry that made cars, made wheels for railroads. And he accumulated for those days a considerable fortune. He had a great big house up on Lake Winnipesaukee called Kimball's Castle. And so he was the richest man in town.
was there...
And he was Mr. Couch's client.
Were many of your clients pretty well-to-do at the time?
Oh, no. I had lots of people, like poor little girl out in Hillsborough.
Who was that?
Who was being betrayed by her husband. Consulted me in this delicate matter of a shattered romance. And to get evidence, she hid in the back of her husband's car while he took the other girl out. I thought that was a rather hazardous procedure. But anyhow, we worked that out, and at no charge.
How
Very pleased. I got a nice letter from her.
you did actually, from what I know, try or were involved in cases of that nature. That was not really the only one, am I right?
Oh no, no, no! Had another had another client named Rose Robertson. Have I told you about this?
I've read about it.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I won't go into that.
No, no. What about Rose?
Well, she turned out to be the plaintiff in a case in which I represented her, and I very energetically brought a suit against the telephone company for negligently leaving a telephone pole in the way of her alleged husband's automobile when he ran into it and killed himself. And we had a decision in the Supreme Court that permitted recovery in such a case, and I think that we got a settlement of $4,000. And the issue turned out to be whether or not Rose Robertson was entitled to the $4,000 or Mr. Boynton, her paramour's sister, was entitled to the money. And so
Rose and this man were not actually married, were they?
no, well, yeah, that was my position was they were. They had a common law marriage. And that was one of the most dramatic, happy experiences of my life, because you want me to tell this story? Rose Robertson lived in a house just up above the mill out in Kentucky, where they now generate electricity by burning waste or something. It was then a paper mill. I went out there one March afternoon, kind of a foggy day, and located Rose Robertson's house. And she'd just done a big laundry, and she had the whole kitchen festooned with the results of the laundry, which were drying with the aid of the wood stove. And the purpose of my visit was to ascertain what her relationship was with Mr. Boynton. But being a young man and Mrs. Robertson being a good deal older, incidentally, she had been directed to me by a friend of mine out in Henniker by the name of Connor. And he warned me that when he brought Rose in, that Rose was highly regarded in the town by a certain fragment of the section of the population, but there was another substantial group who thought that she was something the town ought not to be proud of. So I proceeded with this delicate matter of ascertaining what the relationship, the intimate relationship between her and Mr. Boynton was, as delicately as I could, without much success. Finally, a light seemed to come to Mrs. Robertson's countenance, and she said, "Well, Mr. Orr, if you're asking what you think you're asking, yes. I laid right there in that bed with Bill Boynton for 10 years.
Obviously, it's a wonderful story.
It's a wonderful life.
But you mentioned, even as you were starting to tell it, that it was a very meaningful experience for you.
Well, sure. It was a happy part of being a lawyer. Do something for somebody.
Most of the law that you practiced, though, was not law like that, was it?
No.
What kind of law was it?
Well, the law that was profitable was arranging for people to borrow money, or arranging for people to buy or sell businesses, and that sort of thing. You get better paid.
But that kind of law, has it changed a lot? Did it change a lot?
No, I don't think it's changed very much. And sometimes people get good deals, and sometimes they get unfortunate deals. Mm-hmm. And
in advising businesses or businessmen, and advising someone like Rose, did you use a different approach? Did you have a different philosophy?
Well, my wife always thought I was too presumptuous in identifying with the client by referring to the activity as we. That is, but I like to identify with the client. We're in this together. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're representing somebody trying to get a divorce or trying to sell or acquire a business. You've got to, first of all, satisfy yourself that your client is telling you the truth. That's the first thing a lawyer has to learn. That
Is that
lots
hard?
of times the clients don't tell the truth.
Is
It's
that
a little
right?
hard if you're a trusting soul like me. You sometimes get taken in.
Did you get taken in?
Have the wrong end of the deal.
Did that happen?
I'm trying to think. Yeah, well, yeah, yes, sure. I think anyone does that is holding himself out to be a sort of a general servant of people in need of advice. But I think it's a hazardous business trying to represent people that you don't have confidence in.
Did that happen to you? Did you have people or businessmen come to you for your advice and you were unable, you felt you couldn't, you didn't believe in them or believe in their story? Did you turn them away?
Well, let's see. I can't think of a specific case where I know there were some cases where I didn't want to get involved with people that I didn't want to represent, but I can't be specific about why I didn't want to do it.
The law firm, or the law firm that you worked in over on Main Street and School Street, is that right? That's where the Merrimack County Savings Bank
Yes.
is today.
Yes.
During that time, do you remember any particular personalities, aside from the man that you were sharing office with, who either perhaps even feared people in the law? Were there people like that?
No, I don't remember that. No.
Were there any personalities at that time that do stand out for you?
We, in connection with the sale of a paper mill up in Claremont, some of my friends in Boston put me in touch with a man named Richard Whitney, who had been a broker in New York and a member of a distinguished family there. And he was the broker who, when the market broke in October 1929, stepped up and made a bid for 50,000 shares of U.S. Steel on behalf of J.P. Morgan and Company in an effort to stem the tide. It didn't work. But subsequently, Dick Whitney went to Sing Sing for stealing money from the New York Yacht Club. Well, if you're going to steal money from somebody, the New York Yacht Club might be a good place to start. But anyhow, he manfully served his sentence, and after he got out, some of his friends were trying to rehabilitate him, and they heard that I was trying to find somebody to buy this paper mill, and they thought Dick Whitney might be helpful. Well, he was, in the sense that he raised our sights so far as the price that we ought to be trying to get. And he also was an education in courtliness so far as how to handle a client. My client was a fellow from Claremont, and he smoked a certain kind of cigarette, and one time we met Dick Whitney in Boston at the Ritz, And I noticed that Dick Whitney was careful to have the brand of cigarettes that my client smoked when he offered him a cigarette.
You noticed
That
it.
impressed me. And, well, anyway, Whitney happened to be in our office over here on School Street one day when Senator Moses came in. Senator Moses was a client of Mr. Cooch's, and subsequently I became an executor of Senator Moses' will and trustee of his estate. And as Moses was coming in, Whitney was going out. And Senator Moses was a classmate at Exeter with Thomas W. Lamont, who was a partner in J.P. Morgan and Company, together with Whitney's brother, George Whitney. So after Whitney had gone out and descended the steep stairs that led from our office down onto School Street, Senator Moses came in and said to me, "May I ask, what is the House of Morgan doing in here?"
World War II obviously intervened. What happened to your legal career at that time?
Well, so far as when the war started, I got involved with the Office of Price Administration, which of course was a brand new experience for everyone. And as I look back, it's extraordinary how little the war impacted the routine of daily life, although people's lives were affected differently. And I worked for the OPA for, must have been a couple of years, and then I enlisted in the Navy. And I was lucky in getting duty in the Navy in the office of the General Counsel to the Department of the Navy, which consisted of a group of lawyers from all around the country with a great concentration of lawyers from the banks, whose clients were the banks and the security houses in New York. And that was a fascinating experience to associate with those people and deal with the problems that the country had with respect to procurement and the liquidation of surplus war materials and contracts for supply after the war ended. And I stayed in Washington until March of 1946. So I had some experience with the winding down of the war and the administration of President Truman.
Before we move into the next phase, after that, in Concord, before war was declared, in New Hampshire actually, there were quite a few people, weren't there? You were not among them, who were isolationists.
Oh yes, there were isolationists all over the country, and we early on got an organization going called the Committee to Aid the Allies, no, the Committee to Protect America by Aid to the Allies, and there was a counter-organization called the America First Committee, which had a principal mouthpiece in Chicago in the great Chicago conservative paper. I guess the Chicago Tribune. I don't know, I've forgotten the name.
I think was it the Tribune?
Yeah,
I think it was,
the Tribune.
yes. You're right.
And I think the majority opinion in New Hampshire was in favor of the aid to the Allies, and the principal objective was to support President Roosevelt in his destroyer for bases deal with England when he gave England a group of United States naval vessels. But as I guess I've said before, right up until October of 1941, there were a substantial group of people in New Hampshire who thought that it was folly for the United States to get involved, to take sides against Hitler. But December 7th, 1941 changed all that, just overnight, of course. And so then everybody piled into the war effort one way or another. And everybody, back in 1940, I think, all the males anyway, between the ages of 18 and 45 had been registered for the draft. And the draft in New Hampshire, I think, worked very fairly and equitably, and it depended on when your number came up, when you had to go. And by that time, people over 38 didn't have to go, but I was under 38, so I had to go, and I'm glad I did.
How important were the two events that I know many people made lasting impressions on many people of your generation, and that is the Depression and World War II? How significant were they to you?
I think the Depression made more of an impression on the generation that was just older than I. My father's generation, it was shattering. But so far as I'm concerned, World War II had a very dramatic effect on everyone. But since, of course, a lot of people lost their lives in the war, but the fraction of men involved in World War II who died was much, much smaller than the Civil War and smaller than World War I in terms of the casualties as a fraction of the people involved. So that World War II just caused a great shake-up in the lives of people. And they moved around and got new careers, but probably most of them didn't change their careers very much. It was an interlude.
When you say it caused a great shake-up, why would that be different than World War I?
Well, it wasn't, well, the World War II involved so many more people. Mm-hmm. And the length of U.S. participation was much longer. It went from 1942 all the way through to 45, whereas in World War I it started out in 1917 and was all over in 1918.
When you ended your career in the military, what did you do?
Well, I reported down the Navy building in Washington, D.C., and I was immediately sent out to Pittsburgh to study how the Westinghouse Manufacturing Company was going to survive having all its contracts for military material canceled when the war stopped. And I stayed there 2 weeks, and I got ordered back to Washington to go over and associate with some lawyers in the War Department to draft regulations that would govern these activities.
What was that experience? How did that help you, being in Washington? Did it help you later on in your career?
Well, in the first place, it was a good deal better than being somewhere and getting shot at. But so far as helping me in my career, it had no particular effect, except I made some good friends and acquaintances and saw a lot of high-level practice that I otherwise wouldn't have seen. Mm-hmm. And they got an insight into how the government works and what can happen when people in a great big apparatus get shooting at one another.
Did you feel, coming from New Hampshire, that you were perceived as a kind of country bumpkin?
No.
No. Did you ever have that experience?
Of being a country boy?
Of not being a country boy, but being perceived that way?
Oh, when I went to Exeter, I certainly did. I had the wrong clothes and the wrong accent.
Did you change them?
Well, I got a little, no, it took me a long time to change my clothes. Change my accent, although having lived in Vancouver for a while, I'd learned to roll my R's, so I didn't have a real certified New Hampshire accent.
But coming from New Hampshire, being a New Hampshire lawyer, was that ever an advantage in negotiations outside of here?
Well, not particularly. I never felt it was disadvantageous either.
Mm-hmm. Well, when the war ended, did you come back to New
Yes,
Hampshire?
yes.
And what happened to your practice?
Well, Mr. Cooch had died just before I came back. And most of his trust accounts had been managed and held together by Miss Halloran, and I was able to keep most of that together. And my principal client had been the Claremont Paper Company, and that was still going well, and the end of the war made it even more profitable. So that was going along, and I had inherited the gas company from Mr. Cooch, so I had a little body of clients to come back to.
When did you start practicing with someone else? When did things grow?
Well, I think it was in 1947. Bob Reno, who was the brother of a contemporary of mine at Dartmouth, and had just left the Marine Corps and decided he'd like to practice somewhere outside of Illinois and not in a big city, and he came up and wanted to know if there would be any work here in Concord. And I knew his brother, and I had a high opinion of the brother, and so I told him if he wanted to take a chance, come on up, and he did.
Were you still working over across the street?
Yes, yeah,
You were.
We were over across the street until 10 years ago.
When did things start to expand?
Well, they started to expand quite soon after that, because more business turned up than we expected. And so I'd say that we started to expand in 48, 49.
Did you have any reservations about expanding? Did you think about what that might mean?
I think you always think about what that might mean, and we not eager to be bigger, but we wanted to take care of the business that we were responsible for in a responsible way, and we realized we needed more help. And so we took on more people. And in 1952, well, I got involved with the defending the United Life against takeover attempts from outside the state. And by 1952, that had propelled me into an association with the Peerless Insurance Company, and that took up a good deal of my time and effort, and the problems of the Peerless and United Life were continuing ones, and in, I think it was in '52 that Governor Huntley Spaulding died, and I was named one of the 5 trustees of the charitable trust that he established under his will. And Governor Spaulding had been a very significant charitable influence in the state as long as I could remember. I remember as a boy I went to Camp Spaulding up on the Kentucky River, which was named after Governor Spalding because the YMCA secretary here in Concord had persuaded Governor Spalding to give the money to buy the land to set up the camp. And Governor Spalding had been very active in the Children's Aid Society, and he had been president of the Historical Society, and he was a remarkable man. He was one of three brothers who had inherited the business that their father, Jonas Spalding, had started, making vulcanized fiber for shoes. Vulcanized fiber is a kind of paper that is made tough by putting it through a zinc chloride bath, and the heels of most shoes have this material in them, or did have, because it's light and it's durable and inexpensive. But then one of the brothers, Leon Spalding, Huntley and his brother Roland were both governors of New Hampshire. And Huntley had been governor in 1926 here, Roland earlier. And so when Governor Spalding died, he left the trustees not only the responsibility of disposing of this great fortune that consisted of all the money of his wife and his sister, but also the family interest in the Spalding Fiber Company that operated plants in Rochester and in Rochester, New Hampshire, and in Buffalo, New York. So that the Spalding Trust began to occupy a great deal of my time.
How big was it?
Well, eventually we distributed about $15 million, roughly 2/3 in New Hampshire and 1/3 in Boston.
Mm-hmm. And how did you decide how to do that?
Early on, we decided that we'd have to have an executive secretary who would be more or less a full-time employee, who would review requests for charitable distributions. And we were lucky in having John McLean Jr. as our first executive secretary, and then when his father died, he succeeded as a trustee. And we had Gene Struckhoff, who had been added to our firm, became executive secretary, and Gene Struckhoff became almost totally absorbed in this activity, and he had a very liberal and eleemosynary attitude, and he's since become the great authority on community foundations throughout the country, and it was Struckhoff's inspiration to create the New Hampshire Charitable Trust, which the Spalding Potter Trust eventually supported. But before that, there was a long period between '52 and about 1970 when we had meetings about every 6 weeks to review requests for what we could distribute money for. One of the early ones that turned out spectacularly was a botany professor, of all people, came along and said that the Abenaki Indian language is in a danger of dying out, and that there was much to be salvaged from it because oral tradition among people who have no written literature is much more accurate than it is among people who can rely on written records.
Did you say a botany professor?
Yes, he was
botany.
a botany, and but he got interested in this language business. So he'd done a lot of work on this, and he discovered that Robert Rogers' account of the raid on the Abenaki villages that precipitated or finished off, I guess, the French and Indian War in 1763 was quite different from what the Abenakis remembered. And, well, to make a long story short, we decided to give him $7,500 to make a record of this language and take down on tape the tradition, the oral history of the Abenakis. Well, That eventually led to the establishment of a great Department of Indian Affairs up in Canada, of which this botany professor became the head of, and now it's a great big operation. So we always pointed to that as an instance of where a little charitable money can make a lot of difference. But we didn't have total successes because we fumbled around hard trying to find some way to do something about care, medical care, particularly nursing care and care of the elderly, and too big a problem for any small charitable trust. We nibbled around at the edges of it. But one thing that we did do that I think was very successful, we financed the effort to educate the cities and towns in the state up to the idea of regional high schools. And we got that through the legislature. That we weren't a lobbying group, but we gave the funds to make the investigation and develop the information on which the legislature could act, and the legislature created them, as you know. And in general, they've provided much better high school education than separate little towns can provide just all by themselves.
Well, how big is the charitable trust now?
Well, the New Hampshire Charitable Trust now is about $40 million, and that started with a $500,000 grant from the Spalding Potter Charitable Trust.
And that is a very significant accomplishment. You said that to me before.
Yeah, well, I think so.
Well, speaking of accomplishments,
I think Governor Spalding would be happy about it.
You just touched on this before you started talking about the trust, and that was the insurance companies. I believe that this too, in your mind, had a very significant impact here and was very important.
Well, it was important to me in that I thought that with the manufacturing activities in Concord dying down, the railroad shops moving out, and the textile mills up in Pennacook folding up, and the textile mills down in Suncook becoming less important, that we had to keep what employment we had in Concord. And so we didn't want these raiders from Texas and Georgia to take the company and merge it with some company somewhere else. We tried to maintain the independence of this operation. And that effort took from 1952 about down to about 1970, when Percy Chubb II, who was then the head of the Chubb Corporation and a trustee of St. Paul's School, that's apparently one reason why he heard about United Life. And we went through a number of gyrations in an effort to fend off raiders of various sorts, including the notorious John D. MacArthur from Chicago. And Mr. Chubb came and said, do you think we could acquire United Life? We'd like to keep it going as a New Hampshire company. And so we accepted his proposal, and now we've got a business here in Concord that I guess employs 700 or 800 people.
The whole notion of corporate raiders then is really, again, nothing new.
Nothing new.
Nothing new.
No.
So when you read the papers today and you see over the last few years the kinds of things that have been happening, it doesn't surprise you.
No, and I, as I look back, I take a great deal of pleasure in the success we had in fending them off.
Was that hard?
Well, it took a certain amount of salesmanship and a certain amount of luck, because if the emissary that MacArthur sent on from Chicago had come out with his best price first, he would have got the company. But he thought he could save a little money for his client, and by being chinchy and making his first offer, he gave us an opportunity to scamper around and nail down a majority of the stock.
Luck also played a role in another kind of venture, I think, that you were involved in, where you helped to turn around really a pretty small sum of money. Was it the Murphy Dam? Is that the one I'm thinking of? Or it was a mining
Oh no,
venture?
that was that was a small amount of money.
Well,
And that mining venture folded up, didn't amount to anything.
the one that I'm trying to remember involved a.
Oh, the dams on the Connecticut
That's right.
River.
Yes.
That well, that was a effort on the part of the New England Power Company to create more regular stream flow on the Connecticut River, and it was a significant thing in that it turned the Connecticut River into one of the most highly utilized rivers in the world. The Connecticut River falls 1,300 feet in a relatively short journey of about 300 miles, whereas the Mississippi travels a couple of thousand miles and only drops about, I don't know, 600 or 700 feet. And but that was primarily a effort to persuade the legislature and various interests to adopt more aggressive government stance in support of development of a natural resource.
Mr. Orr,
It was sort of like building the tramway on Cannon Mountain.
help me. There was a client that you had who had a fairly small investment of something like $5,000. I can't.
Oh, that was the paper mill.
Yes. And you
That
made
was-
quite a bit of money
Yeah, he made a lot
in a
of money.
very short amount of time.
Yeah, well, that's what's happened with people who take advantage of, like Bill Simon, who was former Secretary of the Treasury, bought the greeting card company for, I don't know, a couple of $1 million and sold it for 95.
This wasn't quite the same.
It wasn't the same dimension, but it was circumstances that really made it, because the seller got frightened and just was dying to get rid of the mill, and we were able to borrow enough money to keep it going, and then after the war stopped, paper mill capacity was short, and so the buyer of the mill had an opportunity to liquidate his investment very quickly at a handsome profit.
The law that you practiced in the 1950s, how was it different? How had it changed from 20 years earlier?
Well, I had clients whose financial resources were much bigger than my friend Rose Robertson, or the little girl from Hillsborough.
That being the case, what did that mean?
Well, that meant that we needed more help, and that we had to grow bigger, and that our overhead got to be bigger, and also we made more money.
Were you ever sorry, or did you ever, at moments, wish that you could return to the days when it was just a lot simpler and smaller?
No, I don't want to rewind the reel.
No.
Play it over.
Well, when you were, did you have to recruit to have people come and work for you?
Well, generally there were people around. Of course, New Hampshire was always, during the period after the war and right down to now, a place to which lots of people wanted to come. As we've said before, the population has increased very rapidly. It's almost doubled in the past 60 years. And so there were always people coming around saying, look, you got a place. And so up until recently, we never recruited strenuously.
What kind of person did you feel would be right for Orr and Reno?
Well, we wanted to try to find, at least I tried to find people that were smarter than I am.
Was that hard?
Well, sure. No, I mean to say it's it's easy enough to find a lot of people that are smarter than I am, but it's sometimes hard to identify them because good things sometimes come in unpretentious packages.
Hmm. Did you have a hard time, did you have to compete against large firms in cities, perhaps the way firms do today?
No.
No.
No, I never had, never worried about having enough to do. That was a wonderful thing about, I never had to worry about being unemployed.
Well, how is law, what do you think of lawyers today? I mean, how different are they? See, how different is an associate here today than you as an associate in the 1930s, early 30s?
Well, I suppose the principal difference is that I, as an associate in the 1930s, knew that I could strike out on my own within a short time, and that I wanted to do that. And today, it's very difficult for anybody to create a practice from a standing start, unless he happens to be Mr. Noriega's lawyer.
I think Mr. Noriega's lawyers had other experience to prepare him for this, from what I've read.
Yeah.
You're saying that...
I think it's much more difficult because the overhead is so much greater. When I started in, first-class secretary was available at $25 a week.
And today?
No difference. Of course, our fees were lower, too. Well, today, I don't know how much it is, probably $300.
Do you think that lawyers today, young lawyers, are better prepared?
Well, certainly, I think they have much better instruction in the law school than I had. And when you look for a lawyer to associate with a firm, depends what you're looking for. If you want somebody with specific skills and specific experience, or do you want somebody right out of law school who's going to get their training here?
What do you think, because law has changed so dramatically, the courts have changed so dramatically, the world has changed, what do you think young lawyers today miss that you got, something that's perhaps even essential, that you got when you were younger?
Well, I think that my contemporaries had a good deal more independence than is possible today. And I'm thinking not merely of myself, but people I know who are about my age, and I look back over their careers. And some of them have been more independent than others, but in general, my contemporaries who tended to business and worked hard and kept their own money separate from their clients have had a satisfactory practice. And they were able pretty much to determine their own career. Whereas today, to do that is more difficult because of the high overhead costs of getting started.
But why is it so important, do you think? Why does the aspect of being more independent and more on your own stand out as being a very important element?
Well, I just think it's the way I feel. Lots of people may not feel that way. They'd rather be part of a team. Of course, I'm proud of the fact that we have a good team and that we have good esprit de corps, and I'm delighted about it. And I've tried to apply my father's advice to give the other fellow a hand, not be a pig about dividing up the proceeds of our efforts. But some people may feel happier in a collegial setting.
I know from talking to you in the past that one of the changes that you have noticed is that there are more women.
Oh,
in law,
yes. Oh,
and
sure,
that,
of course. More women everywhere.
Why
No,
is that?
more women out of the house, that's what I mean.
Why does that matter?
Well, of course, it matters in all kinds of ways. This is a subject about which I have some fairly settled opinions. I think that up until recently, women were pretty much kept in a servile status, and that has largely terminated. And one would hope, without being too enthusiastic about it, that it makes a better society to have women be able to exercise their capacities completely. I think so. But
The fact that there are more women, how might that change things in law?
well, I don't know is it going to specifically change things in the law any more than it's going to change things in everything else. The fact is that in probably 80% of the people in the world, the women are still nothing more than slaves. And it's only in the highly developed countries that women are able to do what I wanted to do, have their own career, have their own life. And that makes a change. I think, and I hope it's true, that makes more able people around, makes for a better society. I may be wrong, may turn out to be wrong. But this gets into a very questionable problem of contingencies. You can say, what difference does it make whatever happens? Maybe nothing. Maybe we're just a little blip here, and there'll be another calamity, like a collision with a big asteroid, and it'll be all over.
You've been involved in law for a very long time.
Yeah.
I think some might perhaps assume that when you're involved in law for that long, you develop a very deep reverence for it. And I'm wondering if your feeling about the law has developed in that way or changed in that amount of time you've been practicing.
Well, I have a deep reverence for the idea of a orderly and humane society. It's easy enough to have an orderly society based on force, and we see that demonstrated all the time. But to have a society that's both orderly and humane is more difficult, and that can be accomplished only if people are willing to play by the rules. And I think they're more willing to play by the rules if they perceive the rules as being just and being fairly administered. And that's why I think lawyers are so important. And I am concerned that matters have become so complex that the task of lawyers in administering just and fair and humane laws is getting harder and harder.
If that's so, what do you propose will change that?
We'll enact an income tax and lower real estate taxes.
In New Hampshire.
Yeah, in New Hampshire. That'll be a step in the right direction.
In terms of, do you propose any changes in the legal system? I think we touched on this a little before.
Well, I'm not a advocate of reforming the legal system because I really am not an expert in that area. If my friend Frank Hennison were alive, I'd like to know what he'd think about it. But seems to me that it's terribly cumbersome, the way we operate it, and that we ought to be able to do more things administratively than we do with the operation of grand juries and adversary proceedings.
Do you think that given that if what you
I
say
have no specific thing. For example, I'm concerned about, for example, in our rush to recycle waste and building these facilities that chew up waste and make energy out of it, what are we putting into the air? Well, nobody knows, and in general, we leave it to the people who build these things to tell us whether or not there are fatal chemicals or nuclear carcinogens coming into the air. How to deal with that problem short of bringing a suit against somebody and dragging around for 10 years before anything is resolved is obviously cumbersome.
Well, given, if what you say is true, that it has become very cumbersome and that perhaps there's a risk that it's becoming very unjust, what do you think do you think it's inevitable then that law, the way we practice, will change? It has to change in order to save itself, maybe.
Well, I don't know. I have no answer to that.
Mr. Orr, would you, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, obviously it's always a great pleasure to talk about yourself.
Well, I really would love to throw this question at you, but I know you're very modest and probably won't answer it. But that is, what do you think your biggest accomplishment has been here in New Hampshire?
Well, I hope that in general I have tended to, I know some people don't think that I've been kind, but I've tried to be kind, and I hope that I have not been unduly selfish or fat-headed.
Well,
That's it.
that's it. Thank you very much.